All right. We'll go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to Ted.
Thanks, Nick. I've got a couple of issues that I want to share with the group today. And the first one of those is harmful algae blooms. And harmful algae blooms are becoming a bigger and bigger issue across the country, including right here in the state of Iowa. These three pictures that you see are actually all pictures of significant algae blooms at Saylorville Reservoir. And as you look at that picture on the right there, the boats are not sitting in the grass. That's actually the water, and that deep green color that you see there is the result of an algae bloom, a potentially harmful algae bloom that was going on at Saylorville Marina earlier this year. Harmful algae blooms are driven by nitrogen and phosphorus that finds its way into our surface waters here in the state and really across the country. And we have in the state of Iowa the nutrient reduction strategy, which has as its goal controlling or reducing the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that is released into our surface waters here in the state. And according to that nutrient reduction strategy, the majority of both nitrogen and phosphorus come from agricultural activities, which, as we know, are significant here in the state. Nitrogen and phosphorus can contribute to a number of challenges that we'll touch on for water utilities, but they also can contribute to issues from a recreational perspective, whether you're a beach goer or a boater. They can be issues for livestock and pets. From a water utility perspective, they can produce toxins that are difficult for us to remove from our surface waters. We've talked a lot about nitrogen and specifically nitrate historically here in the state of Iowa. We've talked about it so much so that in some instances, folks think it's primarily a Des Moines problem. But the truth be told, there are 50 utilities or 50 water systems in the state that are required to either remove or blend their source waters for reduction of nitrate. So it's more of a statewide problem than most people realize, and harmful algae blooms are becoming a similar statewide problem. Like other utilities around the state, Des Moines struggles with removing toxins that can be produced by these harmful algae blooms, and the best bet for us is actually to try to avoid that source. We're fortunate because we have a couple of different sources, but for other communities, they don't have those options, and so it can be a real challenge to avoid or to try to remove harmful algae. So it's a significant problem. It's also challenging because the science behind harmful algae blooms is not well defined. We don't necessarily know if a bloom is going to produce toxins or not. That makes it very challenging to plan, to forecast, to work. And so what we're hoping for from a state and a legislative perspective is that our state leaders can support more research into the causes and mitigation of harmful algae blooms here in the state and even across the country, that they can ensure that there's funding available for water quality and source water initiatives, and that we can leverage state and federal funds to help us understand and deal with these harmful algae blooms that are becoming more and more prevalent here in the state. Nick, I don't know if you're wanting to take questions or if you want to just move through these topics and take questions at the end.
If there's questions that jump out on a certain topic, feel free, but then we will do a Q&A at the end.
Okay. Well, moving on to the next topic that I'm going to touch on, lead water service lines. And there's been a lot of discussion of lead in drinking water in the news over the last several years, especially since the lead in drinking water crisis that we saw in Flint, Michigan a few years ago. More recently, the EPA has indicated that they're going to update the lead and copper rule, the rule that governs lead in drinking water, and that may likely include some provisions requiring replacement of lead water service lines. Nick, the next slide, please. The lead service line question in the state of Iowa has a lot of variability from community to community. There are some communities in the state that don't have any lead service lines, and there are some that have large numbers of lead service lines. There are also ownership differences. In some communities, the homeowner owns the entire service line, which is the case here in Des Moines. In other communities, the utility owns part of the service line and the homeowner owns the rest. But in almost every case, there is some amount of private ownership. And then, of course, there's a lot of variability in the cost to replace one of these lead service lines. We estimate that an average cost to replace a lead service line here in Iowa could be as much as $10,000 each. Nick, next slide, please. It has been estimated that there are 160,000 lead water service lines in Iowa, and at $10,000 a piece, that's $1.6 billion to replace those lead service lines. There is a lot of interest in getting those replaced. We as an industry think that that's the right thing to do long-term. There's funding available, but there's some challenges associated with accessing those funds that we really want to talk about here today. The funds are being distributed through the SRF, the State Revolving Loan Program, which is fine. They're being distributed with some consideration for disadvantaged communities or disadvantaged customers, which is also, we believe, appropriate and probably fine. But there also seems to be intent to deliver those funds as partially forgivable loans. And so I'm going to just use Des Moines as an example, where we have 20,000 lead service lines. It's a $200 million problem for us. And if we borrowed $200 million to replace lead service lines and then say 30% of that was forgivable, we would be faced with funding $150 million plus or minus for that program out of our rates. Over a 20-year period, that's a significant increase in rates that would be required. Rates are really the only source of revenue that we have. In many cases, especially cases with single low-income folks living at a residence, that would more than double their monthly water bill to add that kind of cost recovery to their water bill for replacing those lead service lines. And in many cases, those would be individuals who don't have their own lead service line, but they're looking at paying double in water rates to take into account the cost of that lead service line replacement. Our perspective is those funds would be more valuable to utilities if they could be distributed as forgivable loans. Give us the money, tell us what the parameters are. We'll get lead service lines replaced for customers who can't afford it, need to have it replaced. We'll work with other customers who can't afford it to replace their own. We'll make progress, but to borrow significant sums of money that are only partially forgivable is a very difficult way to approach the problem. So I think that's the end of that, Nick. If there are questions, I'd be happy to address those, or we can move on.
If you do have questions, feel free to use the raise your hand function on Zoom and I'll call on you. Otherwise, we'll go to Lyle Hammes to discuss PFAS.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity to pitch in here. So PFAS is, as you can see, a class of man-made compounds. It's not in the plural. It's actually a group of about 5,000 compounds, different chemicals. So you may have heard these referred to as the forever chemicals because they are extremely persistent in the environment and almost impossible to destroy. So some of the sources are nonstick coatings, stain-resistant carpeting, water repellents, paper packaging is a big one, such as food wrappers, McDonald's, pizza boxes is another possible source, metal plating, and firefighting foam. The firefighting foam is a common source of contamination for groundwater, it is suspected. PFAS is found worldwide in surface water, rivers, lakes, groundwater, and even rainwater in some places it's being found. So in 2016, as you can see, EPA issued a lifetime health advisory level for that should say PFOA and PFOS at 70 parts per trillion. Now that is for those two compounds together, added up the level, the health advisory level at 70 parts per trillion. Now, health advisory level is non-regulatory, non-enforceable standard. About a year ago, in fact, for Ames, a year ago this week, the Department of Natural Resources tested a number of utilities, and they tested 4 of our wells, and it did show up in particularly one of them. So they tested what they felt to be the most vulnerable wells to PFAS, and they did find one, especially in one particular well. In my opinion, utilities did a pretty good job of trying to get out in front of this, at least to the extent possible. By a lot of us are doing our own testing, posting information on a website. Some of them issued press releases. So, and simply educating ourselves for the inevitable calls that come in from the public, which we did get quite a few of them. In June, this past June, EPA significantly lowered from a combined 70 parts per trillion to individually 0.004 parts per trillion for PFOA and 0.02 parts per trillion for PFOS. Now, this really kind of put the water industry back on heels. That is a significant lowering. In fact, it's so far, you can't even detect those compounds at that level. You can detect, I believe, at a level of like 4 parts per trillion. So actually, it's an odd situation where nobody can definitively say that they meet those levels because you can't test down to that. So you can simply say if it's been detected or not, and if it has, at what level. So this is in tabular form, kind of showing the old health advisory levels. Again, that's 70 for PFOA and PFOS combined. And over on the right, the new extremely or much lower health advisory levels. And in addition to PFOA and PFOS, it added 2 more that weren't previously didn't have health advisory levels, and now they do, as you can see, a little bit larger level in parts per trillion, but there are now 4 individual species of PFAS that have advisory levels. So the DNR is requiring public notification if a defect is found at the health advisory level. And EPA will is expected to issue a formal regulatory standard by the end of this month. The DNR has said around December 20th, so that's coming right up. And we all anxiously await to see what those numbers will be. So now you may ask, so what are the impacts on actual utilities? I can speak obviously from the Ames perspective. In 2013, we tested for some of these species and it was a non-detect. Only recently has science advanced enough and become precise, the instrumentation, to actually detect these. So that's one difference. People kind of have the misconception this is something new. It's not. These have been around for decades, actually. The city of Ames actually took 1 well out of service because of the level we found, which that's a big deal. Just for kind of give you a level of magnitude and cost, we have another upcoming project for 3 wells, and that's budgeted, estimated around $7 million mark. Now that can really vary depending on other aspects of the project, but losing a well it's a big deal. We did get those 2 species, PFOA and PFOS, added to our permit, so we have to test for that quarterly. We did test all of our wells, like a number of other utilities, going above and beyond what the DNR has recently done. We initially put the 1 well back in service at high flows and certain combinations of wells that didn't have those PFAS chemicals. But as soon as June came with those lower levels, we took it out of service again for the foreseeable future. So just a couple last comments. Things that we're doing now currently is we've hired a consulting firm to look at a very high level, kind of general magnitude of cost, what it may entail both in scope of work and cost to remove PFAS if it came to that. Now, again, we're shooting a moving target here. We don't even know what the levels are, but just a very conceptual study. So we've started that. We're actually funding a grad student from Iowa State University to look into our wells specifically and do what they call fingerprinting, because they can actually, as I understand, try to detect exactly where some of the PFAS chemicals came from and exactly which species they are. So we've got that in the works, and PFAS, it's actually, the testing is holding up the well project I just referred to, because we've recently done testing for that. We're waiting the results before we move forward. So we'll see what we find, but those are some of the actual impacts that we're seeing here in the city of Ames.
Thanks, Lyle. Are there any specific PFAS questions for Lyle or other representatives on? If not, we will turn it over to Marty Braster to discuss Iowa's one call system.
Well, actually, Nick, I think I'm going to be the one doing that. Marty's going to talk about cybersecurity, so don't freak him out because I'm sure he didn't prepare for that.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Emily.
That's okay. Iowa's one call system is really designed to make sure there's strong communication between excavators and operators. So in our case, water utilities, but it covers anybody who has underground facilities, and it works pretty well. But we know that there are some things that could be improved, and based on our experience in working with this, and I just want to very quickly talk about those three specific ideas, all of which require legislative action. The Iowa One Call Board, which oversees the one call system, does not actually act like an agency and have regulatory authority, so they can only operate within the confines of what the statute says. Their role is more to put out guidance, to manage the ticket system, and to work with both operators and excavators to resolve issues should they occur. So again, our goal is actually to improve that coordination and to build on the successes that we've already had. First, we want to change the current 48-hour period to be like a midnight ticket. So it would essentially start on midnight on the date a locate is requested. So currently what happens is the 48-hour clock starts ticking as soon as that ticket request for a locate is issued. And if you get that ticket late in the day or after hours, you actually lose some of that ability to communicate. The reason why this is important is that sometimes excavators submit ticket requests for locates that aren't very clear. And and the other part of the reason, particularly from a rural water standpoint, our own staff on our rural water systems are the ones actually doing the locates. They have other responsibilities. They may be 2 or 3 hours away from the locate site. This is designed to give that coordination and communication a better chance of avoiding any problems. The second change that we're requesting is a change in when the clock starts ticking for the ticket life, and that's basically the time frame which that request is valid. Currently, under Iowa law, it starts ticking as soon as the locate request is submitted. And as water utilities, and I think in some of our conversations with other utilities that are impacted by this, we'd like to start that ticket life from the end of that 48-hour period of locate. And then finally, and this is particularly important in the rural areas, a lot of the requests that we get are for excavators who are going to be tiling farmland. And we know where our lines are and how deep they are. If they submit the depth that they intend as part of the requirements of their request for a locate, that will make it easier on us to make an assessment internally. Do we actually need to send someone out to do the physical locate, or can we go ahead and clear the ticket knowing that our depth of line is much lower than where they're going to be? Again, it comes down to the costs imposed on the systems in terms of personnel and time and travel to be able to do that. So there are a lot of other issues I think that are out there with respect to one call. And for those of you who are have been around at the legislature. You know, there was some talk a couple years ago about third-party locate services and whether or not they needed to be certified. I don't think we would disagree that there need to be improvements on that range, but we're not delving into that. We're trying to make 3 specific things that are really focused on that communication and cooperation between operators and excavators. Happy to answer any questions, or we can wait until the end.
All right, we will turn to Marty Brasser for cybersecurity.
Thanks, Nick. You did panic me there for a second. We know that the legislature is interested in cybersecurity and particularly as it relates to essential services like drinking water. There are really 4 main points that we'd like to share today. You can see them there on the slide. The first is that federal regulation already exists that requires drinking water utilities serving more than 3,300 people to complete risk assessments and emergency response plans. And those activities must address cybersecurity. The second point would be that there is significant assistance available to complete those risk assessments and emergency response plans for utilities of all sizes. And you can see we've listed there the main sources of that assistance: public sector assistance, private sector assistance. And again, that's for utilities to complete the risk assessment and emergency response plans that do address cybersecurity. I think the third point we wanted to share, is that private sector partners play an important role in helping utilities prepare for and respond to cybersecurity threats and attacks. And a couple of examples, important examples, are insurance companies that provide cybersecurity coverage. Along with that coverage comes risk mitigation and response assistance. And then there are private firms that provide a range of specialized cybersecurity services. And those can be, for example, helping water utilities actually implement cybersecurity mitigation measures, and also include things such as 24/7, 365 monitoring of a utility's networks and devices. And then the final point we wanted to share today is that most drinking water utilities, even the large utilities, must rely on external resources and expertise to mitigate and respond to cybersecurity threats and attacks. And acquiring this assistance can be a significant financial cost to the utilities. And of course, this is particularly concerning or challenging for smaller utilities. And so Nick, I tried to summarize the 4 main points that we wanted to share on cybersecurity, and would always be glad to answer questions now or as we get into the next session.
Thank you, Marty. So that concludes the issue area overview portion of the webinar. Up on the screen are contacts for those organizations that presented today. We're always a resource on water industry issues, be it water quality, cybersecurity, PFAS, One Call. We're here as a resource. And like we mentioned, we'll share this recording with the legislature and are ready to get to work come January. But now I'd just like to leave it open to questions here. If anyone has any questions on these issues or other issues related to water that we can answer, or any of the representatives here can answer. So if you have a question, just raise your hand or jump in.
Hey, this is Janice Weiner. I have a couple of questions. One is, do you have a preferred way of funding IWIL, assuming it gets funded at some point? And the other is, isn't there a fair amount of funding that came through the federal infrastructure bill to replace lead pipelines? So why would they be doing it? Why would it be being approached as a repay 70% of this loan model? Thanks.
Ted, I'll let you take that lead service line question.
Thanks, Nick. There is quite a bit of funding that has come through for lead service lines, but it is being administered through the state revolving loan fund with the caveat that at least 49% of it has to be forgivable loans, but that means that the other 51% has to be funds that are repaid. And to my knowledge, and maybe someone else on the call has more detail on this, but to my knowledge, that's where the majority of the lead service line funding is coming and how it's being distributed and administered.
And Senator Weiner, I'll add that in working with the federal delegations, it was a federal requirement that it went through the SRF for that funding, and that has caused it to be more of a bureaucratic process, I would say. And it was left up to the states to determine how that money would be allocated, and the forgiveness is from what we've been told, but there are competing narratives at the state and federal level on how that funding is to be approached, which we see in these large bills and these large funding mechanisms. So just at least from the Des Moines Water Works perspective, we've been working at the federal level to try to push for clarification and more forgiveness, and with DNR. So that's where we're kind of at, and we continue to push for more flexibility in that funding.
Nick, this is John Dunn in Ames. I'll just offer that I've had conversations with the SRF folks, and they've told us that because Ames does not meet the definition of a disadvantaged community, that no loan forgiveness is available to us. So for the community of Ames, we would be on the hook for 100% of service line replacements.
Nick, I'm happy to try to answer the I will question. Senator Representative-elect Weiner, this is Emily Piper with the Rural Water Association. I'm going to kind of deflect on the funding side. I'm not sure that, and I don't want to speak for all the other groups that we've taken a specific position on how that should be funded. But I think particularly for the smaller utilities and our rural utilities, one of the things that we agree about is that as we move forward, whatever that looks like, there's currently money that is being used that's collected from the sales tax on drinking water that is being used to fund wastewater and water infrastructure grants and programming for our smaller utilities. And any type of proposal moving forward should preserve something that goes directly to water utilities. Previous proposals have actually shifted the majority of that into agriculture, which then reduces kind of the resources that we have available to work cooperatively with our landowners in terms of water quality management. So I don't mean to kind of be vague on how we fund it, but we're definitely very interested in watching where the money goes to make sure that water utilities who are expending a significant amount of resources to work to improve the water coming into their treatment plants don't get left out of that equation.
Are there other questions? All right. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, thank you again for all of those of you who joined us today and the representatives from the water industry and new legislators. We appreciate it. We know it's a very busy time, and we look forward to working with you on a range of issues. As you can see, it's not just those issues you might think that water utilities are working on. So if you have any questions, please reach out to any of the representatives here. We'll send out the slide deck with the contacts as well as the recording. So I'm going to end the recording, and thanks again, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.